Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. In this series, I sit down with globally respected academics whose life's work explores power, gender, negotiation, and leadership. Together, we unpack the subtle forces that shape how women are seen, heard, and valued at work. If you want deeper insight into the dynamics of influence and what truly accelerates leadership impact, then this is a must listen. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome back Professor Laura Kray. Laura, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
For anyone who, as you listen to this, want to hear the first conversation I had with Laura, it was episode 27. It was over 4 years ago that we first connected on this. But let me share Laura's bio for those of you who are new listening today. So, Laura Kray has been a professor at Berkeley Haas since 2002 and holds the Ned and Carol Speaker Leadership Chair. She's a leading expert on the role of stereotypes, power, and status, and mindsets on workplace behaviour, including negotiations and ethical decision making. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and has been recognised by multiple Best Research Awards from the Academy of Management and the International Association of Conflict Management. Laura's research, aimed at debunking myths about the gender pay gap, was recognised with a Decade Award from the Academy of Management Discoveries for having the greatest social impact on social and alternative media from 2015 to 2025. Laura, congratulations on that incredible Decade Award. Before we jump into this conversation, tell us, just take 2 minutes to share us the key findings from that, and then let's get into our conversation.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really exciting to have this work that took nearly a decade to complete honored for having this impact. And basically what my co-authors and I found is that in today's day and age, women are actually attempting to negotiate their job offers even more than men are. And yet people, broadly speaking, still believe that women are not attempting to negotiate, and thus this is used as an explanation for the gender pay gap. And so we think by sort of updating people's beliefs on this, we can focus on what is actually contributing to the pay gap rather than this, sort of mythical women aren't doing anything to advocate for themselves.
Fantastic. Now, since we last spoke about stereotypes, threats, and negotiation, you've published research that I think fundamentally changes how we think about women's advancement, and this is one of them that you've just spoken about. But you've studied a number of things, and I call out, firstly, even at identical organisational levels, men manage larger teams than women, and that gap can cause pay disparities. And secondly, found that society recognises men for power but women for status. And those two things have very different impacts on influence as well. So I want to do three things actually in our conversation today. I want you to walk us through what you found in the studies. Secondly, connect why it actually matters for the senior women listening today, many of whom have been told they're powerful but something feels off. And thirdly, let's get tactical about what women can do with this information and what our male allies can do as well would be helpful. So, Laura, can I ask, let's just kick off with a little bit of a baseline. Can you define for me what is the difference between power and status and why does that matter?
Sure, right. So both power and status are pathways to ascend hierarchies, social hierarchies, but they're fundamentally different bases of social hierarchy. And the distinction we're finding is critical for understanding women's leadership challenges. So power is control over valued resources. It's formal authority, decision-making control, the ability to direct others' actions, to reward others. Where status, by contrast, is respect, prominence, and admiration in others' eyes. It's social approval and recognition. So both power and status are nice things to have, but we're finding that they are gendered. And what we mean specifically is that power is viewed as more masculine than status. And when we analyze people on the most powerful people in the world lists, we find that men are perceived to rise to that distinction through power, while women rise through status. And this isn't just perception, it has real consequences. We know that power is more stable because it's based on actual control over resources, while status requires constant social validation. And this means that status hierarchies are also more fluid than power hierarchies, making women's leadership positions more vulnerable to instability.
Mm. Can you, because you went there about power lists, let's go straight there because I think it's a great example. You studied Forbes list, I think was called out.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Forbes' most powerful people lists. So objectively successful people. And we found the striking pattern. When women occupy powerful roles, so some of the women on the list are CEOs of companies like Mary Barra of General Motors. Um, they're less likely to be accurately identified by our participants from headshots. People don't know who they are. They're less likely to know who they are than comparable men. So, for example, of all the people who are on these lists, our participants accurately identified only 10% of the women, but they accurately identified 20% of the men. And what we think is going on, specifically as it relates to power, is that people see a powerful woman that sort of goes against the grain of what we expect, and so we give them less attention. Right? It's when information is stereotype consistent. So seeing a powerful man, we know that it's easier to process cognitively. And so the greater prevalence of men in high power roles in society makes powerful men, or excuse me, makes male power more cognitively accessible. When we see power, we think male. When we
Mm.
see female leaders, by contrast, we're more likely to recognize and remember their status, their respect, their likability, their collaborative qualities than their formal authority and resource control.
Okay. So let's go into some of the findings from the research firstly. And I think the one that stood out that I sort of called out earlier was this span of control gap. Tell me about that.
Right. So we studied graduates, MBA graduates from an elite business school. They had the same education, the same starting point, so to speak. But what we found is that as they graduated and took jobs and had their careers unfold, that even when men and women reported having the same rank within their organization, so it could be senior manager or associate vice president, what have you, we also asked them, well, how many people do you who directly report to you?
Mm.
And what we found is that when we controlled for everything, same qualifications, similar job characteristics, same level within the organizational hierarchy, that men led larger teams than women did. And so for in our sample that included almost 2,000 alumni from this elite business school, we found that men had on average over 11 direct reports, whereas women had just a little over six.
Right. What do we think is like blocking women from getting larger teams? Like, was there anything in the research that outlined that?
Well, so consistent with my focus on stereotypes, we were able to conduct a number of experiments in which we, presented people with an image of a leader of a small team versus an image of a leader with a large team, and we took great care to make sure that it was, the images themselves were gender neutral. They were stick figures or, sort of drawings that you couldn't discern the gender of the person. But what we found is that when we asked people, tell me what you think this manager's leadership style is, we found that they tended to see leaders of large teams as employing more sort of authority ranking principles is what we call them. So sort of command and control. They're in charge. Other people listen to them. They get the majority of the rewards of the team's output. And whereas when people imagine what a leader of a small team is like, they say very democratic, very, we're all in this together, everybody chips in, we share the rewards equally. And so that in and of itself is a stereotype about leaders of small versus large teams. In a separate study, we also asked people describe a male manager versus a female manager. And what we found is that there's this very clear overlap between what people associate with leading large teams and masculine characteristics, stereotypically masculine characteristics, and vice versa. People associate the qualities of leading a small team as being stereotypically feminine. And so we think that, even if you, of course, I should say that this research is important because we were able to show that the size of a one of our alums' teams directly predicted their compensation. And so people who led larger teams were earning more than people who led smaller teams, again, controlling for all these other characteristics. And so what we think is happening is that, there's a stereotype about team size, there's a stereotype about gender. And so women may be getting sorted into roles that entail leading smaller teams. And this has downstream consequences in terms of, how valuable the work is perceived to be. Because I should say, people would say leading a large team is more difficult than leading a small team. And so therefore, should the leader of a large team should earn more than the leader of a small team.
Or that's the belief anyway.
That's right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so we have to assume that decision makers who are actually, assigning people to managers and whatnot hold these stereotypes and are being influenced by them, even if it's below the level of conscious awareness.
Okay. The other thing that I found really interesting was the delegation problem that was called out in the research. And so help us understand that, because I think I know what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, there's a growing body of research to suggest that perhaps one of the reasons why we don't see more women leading larger teams is because, by definition, right, if you have more people to coordinate with, you may have to be more, sort of command and control and tell people what to do. And we're finding that women in powerful positions like this are experiencing more pushback from their direct reports. And so that could lead to them taking on more of the work themselves, more burnout, sort of more conflict, socio-emotional labor that they have to manage in the workplace. And in our review of, this literature across disciplines, we're finding this is even happening in operating rooms with surgeons and finding that, they're being treated, sort of asked to do it themselves, some of the tasks that if it were their male counterpart, that the support staff, the nurses and everybody else in the room would, step up to help their male colleagues. So it's a pretty pervasive dynamic as you.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating to me, because even what that's saying is even if you had equal capability as your male colleague in your abilities to delegate, which is a skill, so even if you had that, you would have to, in the first place, contend with more pushback or more expectation that you're going to take more on than your male counterpart would have to.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
So that is fascinating to me, and I wonder if part of that, Jen Overbeck is one of the researchers that we've had a fantastic conversation with in this series. And one of the things she talked to me about was their findings around how female leaders move very quickly from using their influencing tactics to get people to do things, and which is the long-term game, and they shift to using power. So probably more of the command control I say you do type measure, and then are kind of judged harshly for doing that. I just wonder, can you help expand on, because there's a connection on this, right? Like when Jen spoke to me about it, she said there's a skill gap. Her perception was there's a skill gap between, as a female leader, I haven't grown up comfortable with power. And so there's a reticence maybe to use that in the first place. I try softer, more influencing tactics. I then get frustrated because people aren't moving and doing what I need. So then I shift very quickly to power, and I can't hold that tension, if you like, between a little power, then back to influence, a little power, back to influence. Is there, I feel like your work unlocks why we need to do it in the first place. So I don't know. I'll just leave that comment there on Jen and just get you to share with me your take on that.
Well, right. I mean, I definitely agree that delegation is an act of power. You're directing someone else's work. And when men delegate, it aligns with expectations about male authority. And when women delegate, it violates prescriptive gender norms, sort of how we're supposed to behave. And subordinates may unconsciously resist because women, quote, shouldn't be that directive. Or they may test the boundaries of her authority in ways they wouldn't with a male leader. And this connects directly to the power versus status dynamic. If a woman's influence is primarily status-based, built on this respect and collaboration, then delegation feels like a violation of that collaborative approach. Wait, I thought we were partners, someone might be thinking. And the subordinate experiences cognitive dissonance,
Mm.
right? And the consequence is that female leaders effectively get discouraged from delegating. And this means they hang on to more work, which prevents them from focusing on high priority strategic tasks, limits their visibility on important projects, and ultimately constrains their advancement. It also means they can't develop their people as effectively, which often gets held against them. And yes, this connects to research on how female leaders are judged more harshly when they move quickly from softer influence tactics to directive power. They feel they need to because their initial attempts at delegation are being resisted, but then they're penalized for being too aggressive or difficult to work with. So it's a catch-22.
Okay. So now we've got all of that depressing information out of the way.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here
There's
thinking of
more. You want more?
I'm sitting here thinking of these leaders going, well, I guess the good news is there's a scientific explanation for potentially what they are experiencing. Um, but what can we do about this, Laura? Like this is I think we've got a lot of agency in this, so understanding it, what can we do?
Right. So, I mean, I think part of what we're doing now is raising awareness, right? And getting, the empirical evidence down rigorously and, understanding the theoretical sort of psychological mechanisms behind it. That in and of itself is, sort of helpful in the sense that we can depersonalize it if we're experiencing it ourselves. It's not really about you, it's about, a broader dynamic. And then from there, we can think about and test interventions, right? And fundamentally, I think it all comes down to, we have to train ourselves and our people around us and organizations to move out of this stereotype-based lens in how we perceive others, right? And so I think the key is what we call a mindset shift,
Mm.
right? Moving from a fixed mindset where people are saying men are powerful and women have status, or men are authority ranking and women are communal, whatever it is, and start seeing people as individuals. And so it's moving from that fixed mindset to one of growth where anybody can behave with authority, right? It's just a matter of practice and sort of getting feedback and sticking with it.
So how does that happen though? I mean, awareness is obviously a huge thing, but when I think of, and it's going to take time, right, for this awareness to shift and whatever. When I think of the, solo female leader in a heavily male-dominated organization, are there stories or evidence or anything you think of how, how can they call on their allies potentially to help with some of those conversations?
Yeah, I'm thinking of some work out of London Business School. Anitha Ratan and Herminia Ibarra have researched and written cases that we use in the MBA classroom, illustrating. One example that comes to mind is Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, and when he came in, very quickly identified that a lot of the cultural dynamics within the organization were indicative of a fixed mindset culture.
Mm.
right? And so he took steps to shift that into more of a growth mindset culture. And so, it starts at the top, and then it's, what sort of practices do you have in place to, encourage people to act out of a growth mindset? And so, that included, sort of every meeting ending and saying, was this a growth mindset meeting or was it a fixed mindset meeting? And, really keeping it front and center in people's attention, and shifting the way in which rewards were, allocated to encourage more collaboration and, sort of thinking outside the box. So that's one example. Another example that they have really provided a lot of really interesting detail on is the BBC and the 50/50 project. And that was Roz Atkins is a newscaster who, a male newscaster who basically looked around and said, why don't we have more women experts on our show? And, he realized that, we can get there if we just put some effort into it. And so they started tracking it, and they created a competition, a healthy competition, one in which, it's not about shaming people who fall short of their goals, but let's hold each other accountable. Let's document what works. And this initiative has basically spread across the globe, across, a wide variety of BBC shows and programming. And they've really move the needle significantly in terms of having more women experts on their shows. And so it's through effort, persistence, trial and error, right, that you can move from more of a fixed mindset to a growth mindset.
So there's a couple of case studies there that we can leave around on people's desks in the
That's
office.
right. And I always say, I have executives who come to campus and say, oh, great, now what am I supposed to do? My boss is, got a fixed mindset. And I say, well, there are several books out there on mindsets. I'm not, peddling my own work, but here's some books. And you could go back on Monday and say, I just took this great class at Berkeley and learned about mindsets. And, I'm, really going to start paying attention to that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
all, one foot in front of the other.
It's the thing I love about your work, and you said this before. And when you and I first met, when I did you offered the program online for I think probably the first time when we were all locked up in COVID. It was so true that what studying this did was depersonalized it all and actually made it make sense. And I think that that is so important. So if I think then, we're having these fabulous conversations across these series, and I've had the absolute pleasure of spending time with five incredible researchers who are pretty much all your friends. So thank you, Laura, for for that. And we've focused on influence and power and status and things we can do to kind of improve our own influence. But if you had to offer three tips for someone to actually improve their own influence, what would your guidance be on that?
Right. So based on, the conversation today, I would say, be strategic about this power status trade-off. And so understand that pursuing status can reduce immediate backlash, right? When women seek both power and status, the backlash against power seeking women diminishes, right? It's a way of like, okay, well, she wants authority, but she also really cares about, doing so in a way that, garners her respect, right? So people can trust you more,
So if I
right?
stop on that before you go, are we talking there when we say status? Are we talking invest in relationships, build relationships?
Well, it's building relationships, but it's also because it's hierarchical, right? It's saying, I want you to trust me as a leader, that I'm going to fight for what's best for our group,
Okay,
right? That I have your best interests at heart. It's not
okay,
just like I like you and you like me. It's, I want to be a leader so that I can advocate for you,
okay, got it.
right? And that when people believe that, then they respect you,
Hmm.
right? But we can't stop at status, right? So it's important to recognize, that status can be a tool for us and something that, people are less resistant to than power, but we can't stop there. We can use status as a stepping stone to power, not as the destination.
Hmm.
And so we need to demand the resources, the formal authority, and the team size that matches our status. And we need to make visible the gap between the respect we command and the authority we've been given. So
Hmm.
that would be number one.
Okay. And number two?
Number two, again, cultivate the growth mindsets in your sphere. So actively framing challenges as development opportunities, right? Even our conversation here right now, it's like, so this is the problem, but we're not stuck in it, right? We can have you know, we can find solutions, and we don't have, it's not cookie cutter, and we can't just pull out the manual and tell us how it's going to work, but we can try different strategies and
Mhm.
seek feedback and iterate, right? Trial and error. And so actively framing challenges as development opportunities. When we confront bias or advocate for ourselves, we frame it through a growth mindset. So, for example, we could say, I'm sharing this with you today because I believe we can improve our systems,
Mhm.
right? And when you find that you face resistance to delegation or authority, interpret it through a developmental lens rather than a fixed trait. Okay, they're testing me because I'm a woman, right? Um, but I know that that's a mistaken sort of assumption, and I mean, I'm a little hesitant to say prove them wrong because, that suggests it puts a lot of burden on women, but there
Yes.
is that sort of light the fire in your belly and say, I'm not going to let that stop me. And that so we know even that research shows that women with growth mindsets experience less work-family conflict, and because they're willing to try out of the box solutions with their partner,
Mm.
and to reduce that stress that they're experiencing. And they also have better workplace belonging, even when facing bias. Again, because if they experience something negative, they're not interpreting it through the lens of this can't be changed,
Yes.
right?
Okay. Understand. So we can do something about this is the
That's right.
mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I
Yeah.
would say, thirdly, strategically use status or prestige and demonstrate our competence. That's another form of agency that tends to lead to less backlash. It's the dominance, right? Which is I'm higher up than you that people resist in women. But today, people see women as competent, if not more competent than men on average, right? So use that, by demonstrating your skill, your diligence, your independence, as ways to, gain recognition and opportunities to lead. So by focusing on building undeniable expertise and visible competence, but pairing it with these strategic demands for power, using your status to negotiate for larger teams, bigger budgets, et cetera, right? So, see the problem and have a multi-pronged approach to addressing it.
Fantastic. Laura, what are you excited about next? Like what have we not studied enough of? What are you looking to explore now?
Well, I would say that increasingly, working with PhD students and up and coming generations, anytime I present any of this work, they want to understand it from an intersectional angle. And so what that means is we can't just be talking about women as a entity, right? We
Yes.
have women who, what role does race play? What role does sexual orientation play? What role does age play? All of these different factors, need to be considered in combination. And admittedly, that's a really, um, it's tough to do that, right? Because, we're dealing with limitations in terms of sample sizes and recruiting, gender non-binary people, for example, and what unique challenges are they facing? But I think that's the next frontier in this area, and so I'm really excited about that direction that my collaborators are leading the charge on. And I would say, now that we've identified status as this, sort of gendered pathway for women, um, I'm really fascinated by the idea of seeing how status unfolds over time, right?
Mm.
And as, sort of longitudinally, do these advantages, in terms of perceived status compound over time, or do they dissipate over career trajectories? So those are two directions that I'm excited to pursue in the near term.
I'm also just fascinated by watching future generations come through, and I think the changing expectations on leaders. And I mean, I think there's always been, and you spoke earlier about, traditionally associated masculine qualities, for example, and that they are power is viewed as masculine, I guess, as a result of some of that. And I'm excited about, the potential for all of us to flex more into masculine and feminine in terms of the leadership skills that we're using. And I wonder as well how much of that's going to be demanded by future generations, like what that. But I'm not studying this work, so I've just got to watch while you guys dedicate your time and thinking and expertise to some of these future challenges. One intervention, if there was one intervention that you think would create the most leverage, and you can choose whether it's one thing women can do, one thing male allies can do, or one, I guess, collective organizational change, what would it be that you think would advance us most quickly?
Well, I mean, what women can do, I guess, just to reiterate, demand span of control parity,
Yeah.
right? And start paying attention to it. Like, so we say, oh, women are negotiating now more than men, but are you negotiating on that? Is it something that has even crossed our minds,
Mm.
right? I mean, it was sort of a surprise to me when I saw it. Um, in terms of what male allies can do, actively sponsor women into power-based roles and not just status-based recognition. So this means advocating for women to get the P&L responsibility, the line authority, the teams of 15 plus people. When you hear she's so respected, everyone loves working with her, ask, and what formal authority does she have? What's her budget? How many direct reports? Interrupt the pattern of giving women status without power,
Okay.
right? And then thirdly, on an organizational level, I would say, implement the growth mindset cultures explicitly. I think we have enough collective research out there now to understand the power of growth mindsets. And while, it's still work in progress to see, beyond Microsoft and the BBC, like how do we scale this? But we know that there are several things we can do starting today, right? So remove language about innate talent and brilliance from job descriptions and evaluation criteria. Replace it with language about development, learning, and growth potential. Train managers to evaluate based on growth mindset principles, and make visible that leadership potential is widely distributed, not rare.
Mm.
And we know that when we have the growth mindset sort of activated, that it reduces the reliance on stereotypes, it decreases, imposter syndrome, and creates healthier workplace norms that particularly benefit women. And so those would be three, my wish list of three things that we can all do to move in a more equitable direction.
In our last conversation, the final question, I ask everybody is what's your definition of brave feminine leadership and does it need to change? And last time you spoke to us about speaking your truth and questioning the status quo, being an independent thinker. And I'm interested, it may have stayed exactly the same, but if I think about with this understanding now, following our conversation about the span of control gaps and power versus status trap, the delegation resistance, all of those sorts of things, what does brave feminine leadership mean to you today? And does it need to change?
That's a really good question. I would say brave leadership, armed with the knowledge of what we've discussed today, means refusing to be complicit in your own marginalization,
Ah,
right? So it means naming the pattern when you see it, right? So if you're offered a promotion with half the team size of your male peer, you say, I've noticed that the male VP has 11 direct reports and you're offering me six. Help me understand how these roles are equivalent in scope and strategic importance. Right? So
mm,
you're making visible what's been invisible.
mm,
It also means demanding power, not just status. When people praise you for your collaborative style and your ability to build consensus, you say, thank you. And I need decision-making authority and resource control to match the respect I've earned. What formal power comes with this position, right? So we need to be aware of it. And so, it means building growth mindset norms in your sphere of influence. And so using whatever privilege you have, whether it be your status, your racial identity, age, whatever forms of advantage you hold to change the system, not just to succeed within it. And so you advocate for the women behind you to get power-based roles, you make visible the span of control gaps, and you refuse positions that are status without power, and you explain why.
Laura, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your incredible expertise. Thank you also for sharing your incredible network so that we can benefit from these conversations. So lovely to have you with me again.
Oh, and thank you, Melissa. I mean, what you're doing is such a gift to so many people out there, and I really appreciate your interest and your ongoing support, and wish you the best with your series.